All right, let's get straight into this because something important just happened, and it deserves a clear, level-headed breakdown. The Indiana Fever have officially broken their silence on the Raven Johnson situation. And the first player to step forward and address it publicly? Aaliyah Boston. Now, if you followed Aaliyah Boston at all, this should not surprise you. She has consistently been one of the most composed, thoughtful voices around this team. So when the news came down that Raven Johnson had been drafted to Indiana, it felt almost inevitable that Boston would be the one to speak on it first. And she did. On her podcast, alongside Candace Parker, Aaliyah Boston opened up about how she feels regarding Raven Johnson joining the Fever. She discussed what it means for the roster, what it could look like pairing Raven Johnson with Caitlin Clark, and how the front office appears to be approaching this new era of team building. This wasn't a quick soundbite. It wasn't a vague throwaway comment. It was a direct acknowledgement. On the podcast, Boston made it clear that she sees this draft pick as significant. She talked about how she feels about Johnson being drafted. She addressed the pairing of Johnson and Clark, and she spoke openly about the direction the organization seems to be heading. When you hear Boston speak, there's no drama in it. There's no theatrics. There's recognition. There's awareness. She understands that every addition to this roster shifts the dynamics. And let's be honest, pairing Raven Johnson with Caitlin Clark is going to spark conversation no matter what. These are high-profile names. These are players who bring attention. The moment that draft selection was announced, people started speculating. How will they fit? How will the ball move? How will the locker room dynamic evolve? How is the front office constructing this team around its core? Boston didn't dodge those realities. She leaned into them. And that's important because this isn't just about one draft pick. It's about what the Fever are trying to do as a franchise. Boston and Candace Parker also touched on something else that's been raising eyebrows across the league: Minnesota's position in all of this. At one point in the discussion, there was genuine disbelief about how Minnesota secured the second pick. The question was blunt: how did that happen? It wasn't just about the draft slot, it was about the broader picture. Minnesota has been writing significant checks. Natasha Howard reportedly received $700K, and she wasn't the only one. Big contracts, big commitments, serious financial movement, and then on top of that, landing the second pick. That combination raised eyebrows. Because when you step back and look at it, you start asking practical questions. Where is this flexibility coming from? How are they structuring these deals? How are certain teams maneuvering so aggressively? Minnesota isn't alone either. The Liberty have been active. Atlanta has been active. Multiple teams across the league appear to be spending at levels that weren't as common before. Money is moving. And in professional sports, whenever money starts moving quickly, people pay attention. Boston and Parker weren't making accusations. They weren't stirring controversy. They were expressing the same kind of confusion fans have been expressing. The kind of reaction that sounds like, wait a minute, how does this all add up? That moment of disbelief resonated because it felt authentic. But let's bring this back to Indiana. The Fever are in a fascinating position right now. You have Aaliyah Boston, who is foundational. You have Caitlin Clark, who immediately alters the spotlight around the franchise. Now you add Raven Johnson. That is not accidental roster construction. That is deliberate layering of talent. Boston's tone made it clear she understands the opportunity here. She understands that this isn't just about names. It's about fit, chemistry, and direction. When she addressed how she feels about Johnson being drafted, there wasn't hesitation, there wasn't distance. It sounded like someone ready to work, and that matters because draft picks can either create tension or create momentum. The way veteran or cornerstone players respond often sets the tone for the locker room. Boston choosing to speak publicly and early sends a message. It says this is part of the process. It says we see the vision. It says let's move forward. And when she talked about Clark being paired with Johnson, that's where the conversation gets even more layered. Clark already carries enormous expectations. Every move around her will be scrutinized. Every teammate dynamic will be analyzed. Every possession will be broken down. Adding another high-profile guard into that mix is not a small decision. It impacts spacing. It impacts playmaking responsibilities. It impacts defensive assignments. It impacts identity. Boston's willingness to talk about it head-on shows she understands the spotlight is not shrinking anytime soon. Now let's zoom out. The WNBA landscape right now feels active, aggressive, fluid. Minnesota handing out major contracts, the Liberty making moves, Atlanta stepping up financially, teams cutting large checks. That's not a stagnant league. Stagnant. That's a competitive one. When Boston reacted to Minnesota's second pick, there was an underlying theme. This league is evolving financially. Teams are finding ways to maneuver. They're committing resources. And that adds another layer to Indiana's decision-making. Because if other teams are investing heavily, both in draft capital and player salaries, Indiana has to keep pace strategically, not recklessly, but strategically. Drafting Raven Johnson appears to be part of that strategy. And here's something important. Boston cut the ice on this situation. She didn't wait for speculation to spiral. She didn't let narratives build unchecked. She addressed it directly. In sports, that kind of leadership matters. Silence creates noise. Clarity reduces it. By speaking on her podcast, she brought clarity, at least from her perspective. She acknowledged the draft. She acknowledged the pairing. She acknowledged the front office's approach. And that's where this conversation sits right now. No drama, no scandal, just roster construction and competitive reactions. But don't mistake calm for insignificant. These moments matter because months from now, when people look back at how this version of the Indiana Fever came together, they'll point to this stretch, the draft decisions, the financial moves around the league, the early reactions from key players. This is foundational stuff. And the league itself feels like it's in an era where every move carries amplified weight. When Minnesota signs a player for $700K, that becomes a talking point. When multiple franchises start cutting big checks, that becomes a talking point. When a team with new momentum adds another high-profile player, that becomes a talking point. Everything feels magnified. So Boston stepping forward wasn't just routine commentary, it was part of the broader dialogue shaping how this season and Surrey and possibly this era Chaldor and so. And now the ball shifts back to the court, because at the end of the day, speculation fades once games begin. Raven Johnson will share the floor with Caitlin Clark. Aaliyah Boston will anchor the interior. The front office's vision will either click or it won't. Minnesota's investments will either pay off or raise further questions. The Liberty's spending will either translate to dominance or scrutiny. Atlanta's financial moves will either elevate them or invite second-guessing. That's how professional sports works, but right now, the headline is simple. Aaliyah Boston has spoken. She addressed Raven Johnson's draft selection. She acknowledged the Clark pairing. She reacted to the financial shifts happening across the league. And she did it calmly, confidently, and directly. The Fever are building. The league is spending. The competition is tightening. Now, the only thing left is to see how it plays out. I want to know your thoughts. How do you see Raven Johnson fitting in Indiana? What do you make of Minnesota's aggressive moves? Do you think these financial shifts signal a new era for the league? Drop your perspective below, and as always, keep it respectful, keep it informed, and stay locked in. Because this story, like this season, is just getting started. Until next time, stay sharp.